Nadir, 1850 to 1853. Ashraf was a magnificent ruin of palaces. There had been, over the centuries, as many as 6 different royal residencies contained within its huge wall of circumvallation, all beautifully laid out in their time with stone terraces, canals, cascades, and lovely outlands. But once the hall of 40 columns burned down, little was done to restore the opulent glories of former years, and an air of shabby decay hung over the Bagi Shah and the garden of Siraglio. In the enormous grounds, orange trees and gigantic cypress ran riot among a jungle of wild flowers and weeds. The court came to the maritime province of Mazandaran for a brief period each winter, to escape the harsh bleakness of Tehran's plummeting temperatures, but only infrequent fleeting visits were made during spring and summer. So, for much of the year, the area suffered a neglect peculiar to deserted property, with scorpions and small lizards sunning themselves peacefully on the terraces. I had always thought it a shame. Mazandaran is a place of great natural beauty and deserved better from its imperial masters. It was said that the new Shah intended to make changes, and since he appeared to me to be every bit as vain and pleasure-loving as his predecessor, I thought it quite likely that he would soon come to require a residence more in keeping with the station than these crumbling relics of the past. This was the second time in a week that I had received a direct summons to the palace, and once more I went there with a quaking heart, wondering what fresh unpleasant commission was about to be foisted upon me. Even in this tropical backwater we were not immune to the religious uprisings that had been taking place in the capital. The execution of the Bab in July had not put an end to the unrest, merely exacerbated it, with the result that the name of the Babi had become a convenient label for any dissent and sufficient excuse for the elimination. Babi activity was reported everywhere, and I, as chief of police, had found my prisons bursting at the seams like everyone else's, until the executions brought their own form of relief. The stinking, decaying bodies had been publicly displayed as a timely warning to those who might still be tempted to voice their heresies. No wonder the flies had been so bad that year, assuming like a plague from the malarial swamps and lagoons along the Caspian shore. I never asked to be made Daroga of Mazandaran, and I am obliged to confess that there were times when I thought I should rest far easier in my bed as a lowly secretary. There were hundreds of the Shahzadah in Persia, all entitled to claim imperial descent from the thin smattering of royal blood that ran in our veins. The Shahs had always exercised a peculiarly excessive talent for paternity, and blatant nepotism had run riot for countless years because of it, until someone died and freed a post more suitable to my regrettably squeamish nature. Daroga of Mazandaran I would remain. I had a modest estate, a son, and a respectable position in society to support. I couldn't afford to be overly particular about the nature of my employment in the royal service. The post gave me a good pension and brought me to court sufficiently often to enable me to keep a wary eye on those next in blood who were frantically trying to appropriate it behind my back. Rampant corruption and blatant backstabbing were the inevitable results of our system of government. The Persian court was not a place where a wise man took his eyes off an enemy for a single careless moment. Passing through the sublime port which led into the palace complex, I was directed out into the gardens, to the wooden pavilion which had been hastily and half-heartedly erected to replace the hall of 40 columns. Already it looked ready to fall down, the product of inferior design, poor materials, and idle workmen. Persia was slowly stagnating after a glorious past. Evidence of decadence and decay was everywhere. I prostrated myself dutifully on the highly patterned carpet at the foot of a Turkish divan and gave the prescribed greeting to the King of Kings. May I be your sacrifice, asylum of the universe? Unmoved by the essential absurdity of my address, the Shah looked up from the cat which was arching beneath his caressing hand, and made the brief gesture which raised me to my feet. Daroga, you are late. 1,000 apologies, Imperial Majesty. I bowed my head in assumed humility, and he was satisfied. I wasn't late, and we both knew it. But he was young, barely 2 years on the throne, and still felt the need to establish his querulous authority. Now that I have become the humble penitent, we could come to business. Have you interrogated the Shemakan fur trader as I instructed? Yes, Imperial Majesty. I got all the good jobs, the ones that no one else at court would touch. It had taken me 2 months to track down that wretched fur trader and extract his garbled, incredible tale. And what is your opinion of the man's honesty? He was a simple man, your Majesty. A very simple man. I would say he lacked the imagination to embroider such a story. The Shah sat upright on the divan, and the Siamese cat, his special favorite, a gift from the royal court of Siam, sprang down on the carpet, tossing her fantastically jeweled collar, and eyeing me with a look of pure malevolence. It was a serious thing at this court to make a feline enemy, but no matter how I tried, I never had the neck with cats. So it is true, then, mused the Shah thoughtfully. He does indeed exist, this miraculous magician who sings like a god and performs wonders beyond all imagination. The Khanum will be delighted. She has already said that such a phenomenon would be wasted in the Nizhny Novgorod. He must be brought here at once. The Khanum deserves it. I remained respectfully silent, not daring to voice my thoughts. Like the rest of the court, I was hardly weary of satisfying the whims of the Shah's mother. Beautiful, heartless, and politically shrewd, she had been the power behind the throne for the last 2 years, and would continue to rule our lives with her caprices until her son broke loose from her maternal dominance. There was, regrettably, no sign of this happening. The Shah had 3 principal wives, and innumerable concubines, but no woman in the harem had yet shown herself capable of emerging from the Khanum's shadow sufficiently to challenge her insidious influence. We all went in fear of the lady. I intend to entrust this little matter to your worthy care, Daroga, the Shah continued, watching the cat circle me with an ominous swish of her tail. You will prepare to leave for Russia at once. I opened my mouth to protest and shut it hurriedly at the Shah's expression hardened into displeasure. As you wish, O shadow of God. As I bowed myself out backward, my foot trod on something long and sinewy. There was a spitting screech of rage, and an unsheathed claw lashed at the bare skin above my ankle. Another infernal cat. Praise Allah. Not the Shah's favorite this time, but one sufficiently esteemed to win me a frown from the imperial brow and rebuke that brought sweat glistening on my upper lip. You're clumsy today, Daroga. I mumbled profuse apologies like an idiot, but my efforts and conciliation only won me another vicious scratch from the indignant animal. Allah, how I hated cats! The miserable creatures were all over the palace, filling the rooms with the stench of their urine. It was considered a particular privilege to be sprayed by one of the royal cats. One was not expected to exclaim in disgust and rush off to change into clean attire. Indeed, I have known a courtier to cut the coat-tails from his jacket rather than disturb the glory of the empire while she slept. The animals had their own servants and rode in velvet-padded cages whenever the court moved. Some of the especially favored even had pensions. Men have been thrown into prison for far less heinous crimes than trading on the trail of a royal cat. I knew I was fortunate to escape so lightly. I left the palace in an angry daze. It was never safe to leave court for an indefinite period, but my resentment had deeper roots than that. Deeper, and infinitely more painful. This mission threatened more than the security of my post. I had been aware for a year or more that all was not well with my son's health. He suffered a strange disturbance of vision, and there was a weakness of the muscles in his arms and legs that was growing imperceptibly more pronounced with the passage of time. In spite of the reassurance of several doctors, I remained uneasy. We Persians were not noted for our skill in medicine. Even the Shah himself had dispensed with our native physics in favor of the services of a French physician. I did not wish to leave my home at this time, and yet I knew I had no choice. To refuse an imperial commission was to court the Shah's displeasure, and I knew of no quicker road to ruin and death. That night, as I patiently explained to Riza why I must leave him in the care of servants during the period of my absence, I suddenly realized what a great disservice I had done him by failing to provide him with another mother. I had had my share of concubines, but since Rukia's death I had never been remotely tempted to avail myself of the 4 wives to which my religion entitled me. It had seemed disloyal somehow. Whenever the itch of manhood was upon me, I simply availed myself of the services of a woman in my household, and continued to push the thought of marriage into the background. But now, staring at Rukia's pale and delicate child, I wondered if I had not betrayed them both with the selfishness of my grief. There were tears, as I had known there must be. I had encouraged the boy to be overly dependent upon my affection, and now I could not even tell him when I would be back. So to buy myself some smiles instead of tears, I told him that was being sent to find the greatest magician who ever lived, and I promised him that, once my mission was accomplished, I would bring this 8th wonder of the world here to our home before I took him to the Shah. How easily it is to distract a child with promises! If only guilt could be so easily appeased. Watching Riza limp clumsily out of my apartments, I heartily cursed the Khunom, whose accursed whim was forcing these bleak months of separation upon us. As for the mysterious genius I was now condemned to pursue, I wished I had never drawn breath to sing it and chant the garrulous fur trader from Samarkand. Better then he had drowned in the Volga rather than performed those astonishing tricks which had caused his fame to be carried from the wastelands of Russia by the trading caravans. 1,000 curses on you, Eric! I reflected bitterly. How I wish that you had never been born. In order to arrive at Nizhny Novgorod before the end of the great Yarmark, as its famous summer fair was known, I was obliged to cross the Caspian with precious little delay. Rumor traveled at a leisurely pace on the back of a camel, and the tale that had excited the Khanum's bored imagination had been the best part of 12 months in reaching us. I had no time to assemble the elaborate entourage so beloved of the traveling Persian. I took with me a mere handful of servants, among them my trusted Darius, and we traveled as lightly as possible in the interests of speed. I prefer to forget as much as I can about the sea crossing, which was surely as disagreeable as any crossing could have been. The summer storms were unimaginably bad, and our small vessel was tossed about like a piece of driftwood. I was in a vile humor by the time we reached Astrakhan, and the first thing I noticed about this famous Russian town was not the towering minarets of its dozen mosques or the grateful cupolas of its innumerable churches, but the disgusting smell of decaying fish which seemed to pervade the whole city. I retired at once to the mean-looking, insubstantial wooden lodging house, leaving Darius to arrange our passage up the Volga by steamer. The landlady served a meal which seemed to consist chiefly of cabbage, soup, cucumber, and watermelon, and I was gazing at this noxious fare, trying to decide whether I dared to send a mouthful down my outraged stomach, when Darius returned looking anxious. The great Yarmark at Nizhny had only a few more days to run, and the steamer on which he had accordingly booked our passage was due to leave at noon. Abandoning the watermelon in disgust, I watched our baggage bump unceremoniously down the rickety staircase. The indignation of the landlady was extremely vocal. When Darius joined me at the waterfront, I noticed there were streaks of cabbage soup on his robe. If I hadn't been so furious, I might have been amused. I suppose a leisurely trip up the Volga is a pleasant thing to those who are not burdened by severely limited time and nerve-wracking sense of urgency. Certainly my fellow Moslem travelers appeared to be enjoying themselves. 5 times a day I joined them on the paddle box of the steamer to turn my face to Mecca and prostrate myself in prayer. But I am ashamed to admit that my mind often wandered from the ritual invocations. There was no thought in my head except the success of this mission, for only success would buy me a swift passage home to my son. We had arrived far later than I had first calculated, and I knew that time was against me now. Cursing the stately pace of the steamer, I paid a visit to the engine room to inquire whether our speed could not be increased. All I received for my pains was a lecture on the mechanics of steamer navigation, and a tart reminder that things had been far worse in the days of the old Eschinas, which had only recently receded from the waterways. Didn't I realize that it used to take as many weeks to complete this journey as it now took days? Admire the scenery and be patient, advised the old captain. I wasn't interested in the scenery. The wooded hills of the Jiguli and the idyllic coves and bays were quite lost on me as I stared unseeingly into the distance, willing the boat to make greater speed. 1,600 miles stretched endlessly before me as the day slipped away, like sand in an hourglass. Saratov, Samara, Kazan. And then, at last, the square, whitewashed monastery of St. Marcus loomed up on the right bank, and I realized, with intense excitement, that I was finally within 5 hours of my goal. Heavily laden barges were moving up and down the congested river on either side of us, often passing so close that it was a miracle we avoided a collision. The country on the right bank had assumed a new aspect, a high, mountainous range now rising abruptly from the plain below. We turned simply to avoid a sandbank, and at that point I was afforded my first glimpse of Nijni's imposing setting. I saw the gilded cupola of the cathedral and the white, crenulated wall of the ancient Kremlin. The old town was reposing serenely under the shadow of its fortress, as though mildly surprised by the frenzy of activity that was taking place on the river below it. Later, I was to think how much Nizhny Novgorod resembled the man that I had come to find, aloof, formidable, full of astounding contradictions. When we disembarked on the quayside, I sent my servants to acquire lodgings in the Haute Ville. I waited only long enough to ascertain an address before hiring a drosky boy to drive me through the town to the western quarter, of which I had been told. Darius came with me, insisting that the fair was full of thieves and rogues, and that it was not safe for a gentleman to venture into the throng alone. Throngs there certainly were. The little Tartar horse could barely make headway against the tide of traffic that was sweeping out of the fair. No Persian bazaar could compare with the chaos. Crowds on foot, in carriages, and on horseback, droves of cattle, carts laden with jars and casks, and bottles of every description, all served to hamper our progress, and I was amazed to see such an activity so late in the day. Rain teemed down steadily, and the horse was up to its fetlocks in a quagmire of mud that suggested such torrential downpours were a depressingly regular occurrence. But neither the rain nor the mud discouraged a remarkable number of devotees. On virtually every street corner that we passed there was a sacred shrine or image surrounded by hysterical men and women, all flinging themselves down in the mud before the lighted candles and crossing themselves with feverish urgency, as though their lives depended on the gestures. "Christians," said Darius beneath his breath. And in his voice I heard all the ancient contempt of Islam for the unbeliever. I shared his beliefs, but not his contempt. I knew there was no God but Allah. I accepted that no infidel would ever be admitted to paradise, and yet I had made many friends in the Catholic missions in Persia, many whose moral integrity I respected, as I pitied their religious misguidance. They had no hope of heaven, but here, on this earth, I saw no reason to deny them civility of friendship. I could not hate with the indiscriminating simplicity of my servant. So I made no response, and we rode on in silence, though perhaps "rode" is hardly the right word to describe our progress. We lurched from side to side, we were constantly jostled, almost overturned, in the melee, and stinking mud was thrown up in our faces from all directions. At length I was forced to admit the need to abandon the road until the crowds lessened. The little Dvashki boy, a grimy-faced urchin, seemed delighted to relinquish the struggle and gladly directed us to an eating-house, where we were served a passable dish of chicken and rice and unending pots of lemon tea. Returning to the streets an hour or so later, I was dismayed to find that, though the livestock and carts had disappeared, the numbers on foot had increased tenfold. It seemed to me that half the world was bent on entering the western Faubourg tonight in search of food and entertainment. There was plainly no point in attempting to navigate our way through the press of bodies by horse and cart. I paid off the droshky boy, and we continued on our way by foot. In no time at all we were lost. My Russian was not all that it could have been, and my attempts to gain directions sent us on a long series of false trails. Most of the bearded merchants and grey-faced Orientals appeared to be as bewildered and confused as I was myself. It was some time before we managed to reach the famous Kvunian suburb. This area was situated at the farthest western extremity of the fair, and was given over entirely to the pursuit of dubious pleasures. As darkness closed in, groups of drunken revelers lurched out of the eating-houses and began to pick fights with each other on their way to the gambling dens and the whorehouses. Darius took out his knife and urged me to seek shelter, but I shrugged off his anxious, restraining hand. I could not sleep tonight without discovering whether my prey had already flown. Fairs were scattered throughout the length and breadth of Russia, and I felt cold with panic at the prospect of failure at Nijni. I was condemned by the imperial edict to wander the entire face of this huge, bleak country until I found that damnable magician. I would walk these streets all night if necessary before I abandoned hope on an early success. An hour later, I turned a corner and came face to face with the very sight I was looking for. The Kirgits' tent that had been described to me in such painstaking detail by the Samarkand fur trader. Oval-shaped, like an enormous beehive, the huge black shadows seemed stark and rather sinister amid its gaudy and disreputable surrounding. I was surprised and unnerved to find that, having struggled so far to come upon this moment, my first impulse should be to turn and run. As I stood in that half-lit street, I was overwhelmed by a powerful presentiment of ill omen and tragedy, unlike anything I have ever experienced before. All my instincts warned me against stepping into that doomed tent which suddenly seemed so strangely and irresistibly threatening. My legs were like lead, as I bade Darius remain where he was and hesitantly lifted the rush matting that served as a door. It was like stepping into a mysterious womb. Everything before my eyes was red. The walls, the rich Persian carpet on the floor, the pendants suspended from the concave roof, soft, subdued candlelight, and a heady aroma of fragrant oils and incense made the atmosphere weigh down upon me like an enchanting cloud. A strange, heavy languor began to creep over me, and I had to blink clear my head before I could focus on the man who reclined upon the floor cushions. In stark contrast to the warm opulence of his surroundings, he was dressed from head to foot in black, and his face was entirely concealed behind a white mask. The effect suggested power, a cold and thrilling majesty. It was as though I had stumbled upon one of the ancient gods of mythology. He did not look up when I entered, and for a long time he continued to tinker with an intricate trick casket while I hovered by the doorway. troubled by a growing sense of invisibility. He ignored me so completely that I began to be persuaded that he was quite unaware of my presence, and consequently I allowed myself to stare at him with vulgar curiosity. I could not help noticing his fingers, which were extraordinarily thin, scarcely more than bones. They were of positively inhuman length, and they moved with a graceful skill and dexterity that was oddly fascinating. Mesmerized, I stood and stared. And then, suddenly, I became aware that he was watching me stare. The scrutiny of those unblinking eyes behind the mask made me very nervous. There was something sinister, almost reptilian, in the stillness of that black-clad figure. Something that reminded me uncomfortably of a cobra poised to strike. "The performance is over for tonight," he said in faultless Russian. "If you wish to see my skills, you must come back tomorrow." My mouth dropped open in astonishment, for nothing in his grim and austere appearance had prepared me for his voice. Even in that cold, clipped comment, its astounding beauty was quite unmistakable. Only those who had heard him speak and sing will ever know just what a voice could be, for it was necessary to hear the extraordinary resonance and depth of timbre to truly understand the magnitude of his power. I never experienced to hear such a voice outside paradise. To encounter it here, in this drafty, ill-lit tent, held its own kind of terror, for who was he? What was he? To be possessed of such divinity of sound? That first moment when I heard him speak, I wondered whether I beheld an angel or a devil. And even now, after all these years, it is a question I still ask myself. For each time I thought I finally knew the answer, he would only confound me once again. But that was in the future. Now there was only the present, and a need to gather my wandering wits in the face of brisk dismal. "I beg your pardon for this intrusion," I said, hastily lapsing into the Persian in my confusion. "Please understand that I do not come here simply as another credulous spectator, impertinent enough to expect a private performance." "You are certainly impertinent," he retorted coldly in my native tongue. "Stay your business with me, and be brief." He spoke to me with the arrogance of a king, and involuntarily I found myself slipping into the automatic deference that I normally reserved for the Shah. "Sir, your fame has carried many miles, even farther than you may have imagined. I have come from Persia to extend to you the personal invitation of the Shah and Shah." Even as I spoke, I knew I was grossly exceeding my commission. I had been told to fetch this man in much the same way as I might have been required to obtain a performing monkey. But suddenly I was deeply aware that it was not going to be easy. He laughed softly, a sound which made all the hairs on the back of my hand stand on end. "So, you think I come and go on the whim of kings, like other men?" he challenged. "No," I said quietly. "I can see already that you are not like the other men." He leaned back on the cushion, studying me with one curious emotion that I could not fathom. "You speak more truly than you know, Persian. You may do better to remain silent." He rose, and I felt cold with apprehension as he took a step toward me. I knew that I had angered him, but I did not know how or why. "Suppose I do not choose to accompany you to Persia. What will become of you, king's messenger?" The menace in his voice had become indescribable, and his physical nearness was a thing of terror. I was suddenly aware that nothing could save me now from his unspoken threat except scrupulous and painful honesty. If I fail on my mission, I shall lose my position at court, my livelihood, and quite possibly my life, I told him simply. He was silent for a moment, regarding me thoughtfully, and I sensed that he had begun to smile behind the mask. "What is your position?" he demanded unexpectedly. I made him an ironic little bow of courtesy. I am the Daroga of Mazandarian. I see. He folded his arms beneath the enveloping black cloak. Then, may I take it that the chief of police has come with armed men? No, sir. I come alone, save for a servant who waits outside. Allah, why was I telling him this? He laughed again, but this time there was no heart-stopping menace in that sound. That, if you will forgive me for saying so, is remarkably careless of you. I trust you conduct your business with greater efficiency at home. His mood had changed abruptly with my ignoble confession. He was still playing with me as a cat plays with a mouse, but gently now, with sheathed claws. Refusing to rise to his bait, I maintained a dignified silence, and after a moment he shrugged and went to the corner of the tent, where water was bubbling steadily inside the brass urn of a samovar. Removing the little china teapot from the top of charcoal, he poured a single cup, added a slice of lemon, and offered it to me. I accepted the sacred gesture of Russian hospitality with great relief. In this country, tea was a natural preliminary to business. Indeed, a natural preliminary to all civilized negotiation. More agreements were struck in the tea houses than anywhere else. So at least it seemed I was not to be thrown out of his tent without a full hearing. What does the Shah offer in return for my services? He inquired abruptly. I took a gulp of the scalding tea for courage. Wealth? Honor? He made a gesture of impotence, as though these things were of no interest to him, and I took a deep breath as I baited my final hook. Power? He placed the teapot back on the charcoal and swung around to look at me. Power? The resonance of a single word quivered in the air between us, and I knew that at last I had struck the right chord. If you please, Shah and the Khanum, your word would be law. For a time. For a time, I agreed, knowing it was useless to lie. But during that time, I spread my hands in an expressive gesture that was not wasted on him. Yes, he said slowly. I understand your meaning. Then you will come with me? If you agree, we could leave tomorrow. He snapped his fingers irritably. Your persistence begins to annoy me, and you will find I don't care to be annoyed, not even by the Daroga of Mazandarian. Go now. You will have your answer when I am ready to give it, and not before. I knew that if I said another word, I should lose all the ground I had made, so infuriated though I was by his arrogant autocracy, I merely bowed and left him. My fate hung entirely on his whim, but I suddenly wished that I had come too late after all, that I had been unable to find him. I did not know what dreadful chain of events I had set in motion that night, but a deep uneasiness came upon me as I contemplated his presence in Persia. The sense of menace and ill omen was still with me long after I had left his tent. It was dawn before I was able to sleep that night, and when I did, I heard his voice echoing through my restless dreams like an echo of doom. Returning the following evening in good time to witness the performance, I was truly staggered by the sights which met my eyes. Such ingenuity and baffling sleight of hand was virtually defied belief. I was dizzied by the assault of my visual senses, and my brain reeled as all the concepts of gravity and time were tuned upside down and inside out in merciless succession. All the laws which governed the universe were challenged within that tent. Some of the illusions were positively supernatural, and long before the show was at end, I was quietly convinced that I stood in the presence of a genie, created from fire more than 2,000 years before Adam. I noted uneasily that he was left-handed. Every Muslim knows that the devil is left-handed. It is for the reason that we always take care to spit to the left. My fingers felt instinctively for the amulets that hung at my neck. An outstretched hand made in silver and the dried eye of a sheep, killed at Mecca on the great day of sacrifice. Both were powerful protective agencies, and I had never felt more in need of their protection. I took care not to meet his gaze directly, for I already feared his evil eye. The crowd in the tent became hysterical when the performance ended, surging forward, showering the floor with coins and clamoring for more marbles like greedy, wide-eyed children. But he turned away, telling them, with a note of weariness in his voice, that they had seen all he was prepared to show today. They refused to go. Closing in around him like a pack of hungry animals, they began to demand, with mounting frenzy, that he should take off his mask and sing for them. "Show us your face!" they shouted. "Show us your face, Eric, and let us hear the devil sing!" His thin hands clenched convulsively into fists of rage, and I felt a moment of stark fear that he would refuse. For if he did, I expected to be trampled in the ugly mob violence that would surely follow. Then, without warning, his hand sprang open and stripped the mask away. The silence that descended was awesome. It was as though everyone in the tent had ceased to breathe. I was standing very close to him, close enough to feel myself sway a little with shock when the horrific skull was revealed before my bulging eyes. The fur trader from Samarkand had never spoken of this. Perhaps he had been afraid that it would discredit a tale already larger than life, for certainly no one who had not seen would ever have believed in such a living horror. I could not take my eyes from him. I stood and stared like a mannerless peasant, aghast by an unparalleled, inhuman ugliness that was made somehow all the more terrible by the hatred that looked out of his sunken eyes and the pain that twisted his grotesquely deformed lips. In that tense moment before he began to sing, I sensed his deep and overwhelming loathing of the crowd. And then I forgot everything as the real magic was revealed to me for the first time. Nothing I had seen till now could compare with the wonderful alchemy that turned sound into liquid gold within my ears, and washed me out of that dimly lit tent on a swift-moving tide of ecstasy. For he sang of love, and with every nuance of his voice I saw Rukia, reaching out to me across the endless void which separated us. Every word and every note brought us closer, so close that I found myself holding out my arms to her embrace. Then silence fell once more, and the vision was gone. My throat closed, and I wept, as so many were weeping all around me. When the song ended, the crowd drifted from its tent in soundless wonder. There could not have been a single person present who was not severely shaken and deep in private thought. He had conjured every remembered sadness from our racial memories and distilled it to a peak of unbearable beauty. No human mind could have tolerated more pain that evening. He had been revenge upon us all. When the tent was empty, I watched him replace the mask mechanically with hands that trembled with emotion, and I wondered what terrible anguish of the past enabled him to express such an exquisite refinement of grief. A remarkable physical change came over him as soon as his hideous face was out of sight. His shoulders straightened, and his entire frame once more exuded the mysterious strength and power that I had sensed last night. A moment before he had seemed like an old man. Now he might have shed 30 years in as many seconds. And I was once more aware that he was in the prime of manhood, probably a few younger than myself. Probably a few years younger than myself. "You have come for your answer, I suppose," he said grimly, when I continued to linger pointedly by the velvet-covered table. "You will be greatly honored in Persia," I reminded him. "Anything you desire will be yours." "No one in this world can give me what I desire," he said shortly. "Not even the Shah of Persia." "But you will come with me." He raised his shoulders in an elegant, scornful shrug. Apparently, he said, and turned away to relight the charcoal in the samovar. The following day coincided with the end of the great fair, and the mass exodus from Nizhny Novgorod began in earnest. There was no immediate passages to be had on the paddle steamers, which were now full of rich merchants heading for home, and the best I could arrange was a place for our party aboard a barge grossly overcrowded with people, chests of tea, and bales of cotton. We travelled as far as Kazan by river, and there, very early in the morning, I chanced upon him unloading his horses with an air of quiet determination. "What are you doing?" I demanded in alarm. "There was no time to go ashore." "I intend to travel no farther like a crate of tea," he told me calmly. "You, of course, may do exactly as you please." "You can't seriously mean to travel to the shore of the Caspian by land," I gasped. He glanced at me carelessly across the horse's mane. "Perhaps I do not choose to continue at all. I don't care to be confined in disagreeable proximity to the human race." Sensing defeat, I did my best to conciliatory. "I admit the journey has not been comfortable." "Comfort has nothing to do with it," he muttered. "I have every hope of transferring to the steamer at Samara, in which case we shall reach the Caspian in a matter of days." "I'm not interested in speed," he retorted sharply. "Only in privacy. If I am to continue this journey at all, it will be by land." I lost my temper. "That is ridiculous!" I flared. "Such a journey would take us weeks! Weeks! How am I to explain this unpardonable delay to the Shah?" He spread his hands in an arrogant gesture of indifference. "Perhaps you would prefer to explain your failure instead. Goodbye, Daroga. Enjoy the remainder of your voyage aboard this floating packing case." As he turned and began to lead his horses ashore, I grabbed at his sleeve. "Wait." I knew that if I permitted him to disappear into Kazan now, I should never succeed in tracking him down a second time. "Give me time to arrange the unloading of my own belongings, and we shall proceed as you wish. Exactly as you wish. But I warn you, now that the Imperial displeasure is not a thing to be lightly risked. The King of Kings does not like to be kept waiting." "King of Kings must learn patience," said Eric coldly, "like everyone else." That was the first occasion that I bowed to his capricious whims. First of many, had I but known it. Before we left Kazan, he insisted on visiting the mausoleum, which stood roughly a mile outside the town. Since I had now abandoned all hope of swift return to Persia, and because I did not trust him out of my sight for 2 minutes, I was forced to accompany him through the dank, ill-smelling catacombs to admire the bones of those who had died 3 centuries ago at the siege of Kazan. Human remains made me nervous, and I was horrified when he began to assemble the relics of an entire skeleton, placing it patiently, bone by bone, into a bag. "What do you want to do with that?" I demanded uneasily. "You're surely not going to take it away with you?" "But of course," he replied calmly. "I have rarely seen such a perfectly preserved specimen. Look, it is possible to see where the knife chipped the rib bone on penetration." "How can you tell it was a knife?" "I have dissected sufficient corpses who died of knife wounds to know the signs are unmistakable." "Dissected?" I stared at him aghast. "You have performed dissections?" "From time to time. It is the only way to reach any true understanding of the human body. I have an academic interest in the physiology of Homo sapiens, a certain curiosity, you understand." The way he spoke of the human race was very unsettling. It was as though he did not include himself within the species at all. A shiver passed through my body, and I was deeply relieved when we were out in the sunlight again. I asked him no more questions. I did not want to know what kind of a man collected skeletons from tombs and dissected dead bodies to satisfy an academic interest. Several times before we left Kazan, he devastated me with fresh evidence of utter immorality. Walking with him through the streets of this little Moscow one night, I was horrified to observe that each time he passed a wealthy Tartar merchant, a leather purse would appear briefly in Eric's hand on its way to some hidden repository in his cloak. It seemed to me that these purses were leaping into his fingers by magic alone. But though I watched him closely, I was never able to register the moment when his hand dipped effortlessly into a capacious pocket. Later I began to understand that the only reason I had seen anything at all was because he wished me to see. He appeared to enjoy shocking me, and I am forced to admit that though his company was certainly highly disconcerting, it was never for one single moment dull. I was like a well-behaved child playing truant from school in the company of a perfect rogue. When he offered to teach me the trick, I actually hesitated for a moment, weighing the consequences of being caught before refusing with a show of righteous indignation. But reality descended upon me abruptly once we left the Tartar splendor of Kazan. During our interminable trek through the primeval forests that line the banks of the Volga, suffered many uneasy moments. We were a small party, completely vulnerable to the bands of robbers who roamed the waterways in search of foolhardy and unwary travelers. Darius slept with a loaded pistol beside his pallet and persuaded me to do the same. But Eric seemed utterly indifferent to the danger, often disappearing by himself into the thick of the forest without warning or explanation, and remaining absent for the camp for several nights. On closer acquaintance, I found him moody and changeable. It was never possible to predict his humor or anticipate the moment when good temper would abruptly give way to bad. He was subject to fits of black melancholy, and when such a mood came upon him, he would withdraw into his tent and refuse to move any further, neither eating nor speaking for days at a time. Anyone who disturbed him at such a moment did so with considerable risk to life and limb, for as we quickly learned, he had a violent and ungovernable temper. And then again, just as unpredictably, he would become amusing and sociable once more, showing off his astonishing skills as a magician, musician, and ventriloquist, stunning us all with each fresh evidence of his inexhaustible ingenuity. In such a mood, he was occasionally prepared to linger by the campfire and humor my curiosity with tales of exotic travel. He seemed to have lived for a time in most of the countries that cover Europe and Asia, and in India he had spent a brief sojourn among the mystics in the tented empire of Karak Khitan that lies south of the western Himalayas. He was a born storyteller. Extraordinary legends fell from his lips with a rhythmic and compelling intensity that held the listeners spellbound. I learned more of the secrets of the world during those weeks of travel than I could ever have done in a whole lifetime of study. But of his personal history I gained very little insight. He never spoke of the life that must have once been his in the days before he began to roam the earth, driven by an insatiable lust for knowledge. He hid his past just as he hid his face, and even the most innocuous attempt to pry was greeted with hostility. We had traveled in this manner for several weeks, when the weather abruptly turned against us. For days in succession heavy clouds rolled in over the Volga, and rain sluiced down from the iron-gray sky in a relentless sheet that turned the ground beneath our horses' hooves into an impassable quagmire. We were soaked to the skin as we rode, and it was impossible to dry our clothes at night around the inadequate braziers in our tents. The steamy tropical heat of Mesodarian seemed very far away. And in this unseasonably cold and cursedly wet spell, I took a cold that left me coughing like an old man. By the time we reached Kamichen, where the storms closed in and made further travel out of question, I was burning up with fever. Darius covered me with the driest blankets he could find, and I spent a wretched night listening to the rain drumming incessantly on the stretched hide of the tent. By morning, pain was knifing through my chest with every breath I took. I was still struggling to draw air into my lungs when Eric strode unexpectedly into my tent and bent over my pallet. "Your servant told me you were ill." His eyes examined me with shrewd concern. "How long have you had pain on breathing?" "A few hours," I said sullenly. "This filthy climate and your stubbornness are entirely to blame for it." He put a cold hand on my forehead, and I gasped at his chilling touch. It was not a natural coldness, such I could safely have attributed to the weather, but rather the stone-cold, bloodless chill we associated with death, a coldness that would remain unchanged even in the fierce heat of Mazandarian. I twisted my head away from a touch that reminded me so uncomfortably of mortality. "Inflammation of the lungs," I heard him mutter. "I shall prepare an infusion that will help." "So you're a doctor too, are you?" I said rudely. "Is there no end to your accomplishments?" He rose and looked down on me with extraordinary calm. "I have certain skills that you may have cause to be glad of. But of course, if you would prefer to rely on the remedies of your idiot servant, that is certainly your privilege." He walked out of my tent without a backward glance, and I lay glaring at the leather walls with feverish irritation. Why should I trust him? He was as likely to poison me as anything else, particularly after the manner in which I had insulted him. I did not feel inclined to submit to dubious gypsy cures. Inflammation of the lungs. What could he know of it? I remember very little of the following days. I plunged into a realm of fevered nightmares, through which I was only dimly aware of the rogue Darius tending me and a strange, dark faceless shape that occasionally bent over my pallet to utter some scathing challenge. "Try, damn you! I can do nothing for you if you're just going to give up." Each time I heard that voice, I had a vague impulse to struggle up and hit its owner. And for a little time the darkness would recede from me. But I was growing very weary, and all I really wanted to do was to slide effortlessly down into the welcoming oblivion. Down, down, down into the peace where Rukia waited patiently for me. And then there was music. Music soft and soothing as a waterfall. Music that coaxed my unwilling soul back up into the light with its sweet unspoken promise. "Trust me. Follow me. Let me show you the way to her side." I believed in the music. I followed it without question. And when I awoke in the grayness of my tent with only Darius beside me, I wept at the cruelty of his fiendish deception. "He said you would wake weeping, if you woke at all, master," said Darius quietly. "He said I was to take no notice and give you this." Darius lifted me from the pallet and trickled a little foul-tasting syrup down my throat. When he laid me down again, I saw the Koran lying beside my head. And then I knew just how close to paradise I had been. And my extremity of illness had aroused Eric's concern. Certainly my convalescence appeared to bore him utterly, for he did not come near me again until I was back on my feet. And when I made some tentative reference to gratitude, he only laughed rather scornfully and told me that my death would have proved most inconvenient to him at this point in the proceedings. He stayed with me on that occasion until quite late in the evening, taking advantage of my weakened state to win a hefty sum of money from me in successive games of chess. But at length, when he grew bored with my uninspired play, he got up, put the chessboard away, and tossed his winnings down on my pillow. "What is this?" I demanded in surprise. He shrugged. "You're tired. It wasn't a fair contest. But beware, tomorrow we shall have treble the stakes, and believe me, I shall show you no quarter." He turned and strode out of the tent without another word, and his wake, the wind blew the flaps apart. As I struggled over to tie them shut, I glanced out and saw it happen. A man in Kalamuk dress came at him from the undergrowth with a knife, but before I could utter a word of warning, Eric had rounded like a wildcat on his assailant. A thin lasso whipped around through the air, neatly garroting the intruder with one swift, savage jerk, and the man fell dead in the churning mud almost before I had time to blink. I was dumbstruck by the lightning reflex, an automatic, merciless response which betrayed all in the instincts of a jungle predator to whom it is a natural and killing commonplace as breathing. He had killed before, many times. Of that simple fact there could be no question of doubt. As I stood at the mouth of my tent, gaping in modern-mouthed horror, Eric bent down to release the lasso with a careless flick of his fingers and replace it in some unseen respiratory in his cloak. He was utterly composed and detached, and he wrung a chicken's neck instead. He could hardly have displayed less emotion, and this deadly calm unnerved me as much as the ruthless, unthinking speed with which he had killed. Pushing the body aside with his foot, he glanced up and saw me standing there, staring at him like some witless idiot. "Go back inside your tent, Daroga." I heard the frown in his voice. "You should find it erroneously tedious to have to save your life a second time." And with that he turned on his heel and disappeared into the enveloping darkness. I returned to my bed deeply shaken, and tried to reconcile myself to this new and most unwelcome knowledge. He was not merely the greatest magician, the most remarkable ventriloquist, and the most accomplished musician I had ever seen. He was also the most coldly efficient murderer. Only the most suicidal fool would fail to treat him with rare respect. The small ship that waited for us in the Astrakhan harbor was still flying the imperial flag, and Eric's vanity was sufficiently mollified by the sight of it for him to board the vessel without protest. I promised him privacy during the voyage. I would have promised him the moon and the stars to get him safely out on the Caspian Sea, where I could be reasonably certain that he could not contrive to vanish on me again. The final stage of our journey was mercifully uneventful, and at length we sighted the great chain of sandhills that ran along the edge of the Mediterranean seacoast. Behind them lay the Merdabas, or dead waters, an endless succession of stagnant lagoons surrounded by dense jungle, swamps, and quicksand. Every manner of reptile wallowed in those stinking morasses, and clouds of mosquitoes hummed incessantly in the pestilential air. The maritime provinces were a death sentence to unacclimatized Europeans, and once we had landed, I made haste to the gentle air of Ashraf, where the sweet familiar scent of cypress trees waited to embrace us. The little houses with their sloping roofs, wide verandas, and stained glass windows had never looked more beautiful, and though I knew we should press on inexorably to Tehran, where the court was in residence, Allah himself could not have commanded me to go a step farther without a sight of my child. If I had hoped to impress Eric with the grandeur of my estate and my royal descent, I was quickly disappointed. "I understand the princes outnumbered the camels and fleas in Persia," he remarked with gravity. I felt myself flush. Allah, he had barely set foot in the country. How had he managed to unearth that most wretched of proverbs so soon? He studied my discomfort for a moment with quiet amusement. "Never mind, Daroga," he said softly. "If I'm ever seized by the need to shed royal blood, at least I know where to find it." I sensed a smile behind the mask, and in spite of my annoyance, I could not help laughing with him. "You will have to learn to muzzle your tongue at court," I warned him seriously. "Merciless wit is a very dangerous possession." "I shall try to remember that. And in the meantime, all mockery aside, I am truly honored to sleep beneath your royal roof tonight." I was moved by his genuine courtesy, astonished to see him shed his cold, abrasive manner and assume instead the demeanor of a perfect house guest, charmingly civil and appreciative. This invitation to my home seemed to mean something deeply significant to him, and if it were not for the mask, I could almost have believed I was entertaining a young gentleman from the British mission. We sat together on the veranda in quiet civility, while my curious servants plied us with Callian's coffee and ices, and it was there that my son stumbled upon us, while his attendant hovered apologetically at a distance, expecting rebuke. "Father, you've been away so long. I thought you were never ever going to come back." I untwined myself from the urgent grasp that I had missed so much and set the boy back on his feet, steadying him when he seemed to lose balance. "Riza," I approved gently, "this is no way to conduct yourself in front of guests." Eric stood in silence as the child turned his vague, wandering glance toward him. "May your heart never grow narrow, sir," came respectfully enough, and then with a sudden burst of excitement that would no longer be contained within the prescribed limitations of decorum. "Oh, sir, are you really the greatest magician in the whole world?" "Some have called me that." Eric's voice was surprisingly gentle. He took the child's outstretched hand and turned it over in his grasp with that seemed for a moment as though he studied the palm. "Oh, please say you'll show me some magic before you leave." Eric glanced briefly, questioningly toward me. I gave him a sad, helpless shrug. "I would be delighted to," he said kindly. "And for you, Riza, there shall be something very special, something no human ear has ever heard before or shall hear again. No, not even the Shah himself." I saw the spellbound look on my son's face as he raised his hands instinctively toward the source of that extraordinary voice. "Will you show me now, sir?" "Tomorrow," Eric demurred. "I'm afraid it will have to be tomorrow. Can you be very patient and wait till then?" "Riza, you're forgetting your manners." Discomforted by the strange communion that I sensed between them, I spoke more sharply than I had intended. "Return to your quarters now, and I will come to you later." "Yes, father." I heard the hurt surprise in my child's voice as he permitted his attendant to lead him away. A tense silence descended on the veranda in his absence. Eric returned to the white wicker chair and examined the dregs of his coffee cup with odd intensity. "How long has the boy's sight been failing?" he demanded abruptly. "Perhaps 18 months. And the weakness of the muscles came later?" "Yes." I swallowed my own coffee with difficulty. "I am told it is a childish malady which he will grow out of in time." Eric sighed as he set the cup down on the table. "This is a progressive and degenerative sickness, Daroga." I stared at him. "Then you do not think he will regain sight after all?" "I do not think it is a thing you should hope for," he said evasively. "Now I have work to attend to. Perhaps you would be good enough to excuse me from supper tonight." I inclined my head and was left alone to brood upon his words. My servants told me that lights burned in his room all night, and that when he eventually emerged from the apartment next day, he was carrying a curious doll-like figure. Some time later I saw the figure for myself in Riza's quarters. It was not a doll, but an automaton, dressed in the robes of a Russian peasant, bearing a fiddle in one hand and a bow in the other. As I watched it bend swiftly from the waist and place the fiddle beneath its chin, I smiled involuntarily and waited for the simple gesture to be repeated. I had not seen such fluid refinement in the clockwork mechanism before. "That's very clever," I started to say, but Riza clutched at my arm urgently. "Wait, father! It's not finished yet! Listen!" When the figure began to play, swaying gently to the rhythm of its own melody, I was intrigued, but not yet dumbfounded. I told myself that I was listening to an intricate musical box, an ingenious but scarcely world-shattering invention. When the tune ended, Riza told me to applaud. "It won't play again until we do," he insisted gravely. I hid a smile. "Eric, I thought with quiet amusement. What an incorrigible showman you are. And I clapped politely to humor the child. When the figure did not move, I assumed its clockwork mechanism had run down. You must clap with enthusiasm to satisfy an artist's insatiable vanity, said Riza severely. That is what Eric told me. Puzzled, I put my hands together with greater vigor. Louder, said Riza with a touch of impetuousness in his voice that I had never heard before. Louder, father, louder! The palms of my hands began to sting, but just as I was thinking I had had enough of this child nonsense, the gypsy figure bowed with condescension, replaced the fiddle beneath his chin, and began to play a different tune. 3 times I repeated the prescribed procedure, and each time the music was different. I thought I recognized the same melody, but the sequencing altered subtly on each occasion so that it was virtually impossible to determine which was the original phase and which the cunning variation. The more I struggled to pin the illusion down, the more confused and frustrated I became at my inability to govern my scattering senses. But at least there was one simple hoax I would expose. Eric had evidently built some kind of delay into the mechanism. All I had to do was wait, without applauding, and the cunning little device would betray itself by playing again. I was so determined to place the invention within the realm of my comprehension that I gave no thought to the disappointment I might cause my son in revealing the secret of this trick. Don't clap, I ordered suddenly. Let's see what happens. We stood and waited in resounding silence. Without applause, the curious little automaton remained mutely aloof, and I fancied it was staring at me with some of its maker's contempt. I told you it wouldn't work, said Riza suddenly. I told you what Eric said. I don't want to hear what Eric said, I shouted, suddenly furious at the boy's lavish parroting of the name. Give me the key, and I will wind it up again. There is no key. Don't be absurd, child. Of course there must be a key. I snatched up the figure and began to examine it angrily. But it was just as he said. I could find no way of controlling this automaton, and as I was suddenly overwhelmed by a fierce, mindless urge to smash it against the wall in fury. Stop shaking it, sobbed Riza. You'll break it. Please, father, please give it back to me. Slowly I came to my senses and relinquished my mechanical grip upon the figure. Allah! What had come over to me to make me act like a demented, petulant child? Riza. I hurried across the room to the floor cushions where the boy had crawled to take refuge with his precious toy. Riza. He turned his face away from me into the satin pillows and shrugged off my hand. I was stunned by the unexpected rejection and appalled to realize how thoroughly I had deserved it. I crept from the room in shame and leaned against the door, trying to regain my composure. After a moment, I heard the child clapping frantically, and then those slow, strangely maddening notes began to play all over again. Late that evening, I found Eric sitting on the edge of the fountain in the courtyard garden, lazily trailing his long fingers on the spray. I wanted to ask him how the automaton worked, but the memory of my intentionally irrational behavior that afternoon had me silent. Mosquitoes buzzed irritatingly around as he accepted the bowl of sherbet that I offered. Your wife has been dead for some time, he said unexpectedly. Since it is not customary for those of your faith to confine themselves in a monogamous manner, I must assume that you loved her very much. I looked up, outraged by the impertinence of this remark, and was silenced by the extraordinary compassion in the eyes behind the mask. His pitying glance took my breath as effectively as the blow to the spleen and filled me once more with a terrible sense of ill omen. I became aware that I had started to tremble. Does the child resemble her? He persisted with sadness. Yes. My voice was thin, reedy whisper. Suddenly all I wanted to do was run from this. I am very sorry, he said, and replacing the untouched sherbet on the wicker table, he disappeared through the full-length windows on the garden wall of the house. I sat very still, staring at the smooth olive-skinned hands which lay limply on my lap. If the Shah's personal physician had told me my son was dying, I would have refused to believe him. I would have gone on clinging stubbornly to the last straws of hope like a drowning man. But I could not close my mind to the meaning of Eric's carefully veiled insinuation. I could not deny his mystical inner knowledge of things beyond my simple understanding. My son was dying, and the strange masked man, who killed with a qualm of conscience and seemed untroubled by morality of any kind, was moved to generous pity of my plight. He was still ruthless, dangerous, and shockingly immoral, but I found that I no longer thought of him as a cold and heartless monster. We lingered at the Astraf many days longer than had been my original intent, for I was sunk in a despair that no longer admitted to the urgency of the Shah's displeasure. What did it matter now whether I kept my post, my favor, my petty position in society? What did anything matter any more? Soon I would have lost everything that made life dear to me. My resentful bitterness resolving itself at length into fierce need of a woman, I sent for a girl who had served me well in the past and lost myself eagerly in the soft welcoming curves of her body. It meant nothing, but it brought physical relief. A few moments of delirious pleasure had blessed forgetfulness that permitted me to function the man Allah had created. I pitied any man who was denied this lacking of such simple healthy need in the form of a wife, a concubine, even a prostitute. But when I thought of such a man, my mind instinctively shied away, willing to contemplate vicarious pain on behalf of another. I did not wish to think of what the face must inevitably have denied to Eric, for now. I had quite enough of pain of my own. Riza spent those few days almost entirely in the company of a magician whose voice and astonishing skills held him utterly mesmerized. For hours at a time he would sit at Eric's feet like a young addict in an opium den, begging shamelessly for another story, another song, and I marveled at the tireless good humor of a man scarcely notable for equanimity and patience. Sometimes he would teach the boy a few simple tricks, guiding the child's hands with all the unseen skill of a clever puppeteer. That's good. It's very much better, Riza. You may show your father now. Their voices drifted past me, echoing through the distant chambers. Of my wretchedness, until at last I roused myself sufficiently from this stupor of inactivity to announce our departure. I was unprepared for the violence of Riza's reaction. Why must he go so soon? Why can't he stay a little longer? Riza. The Shah has commanded his presence at court. You know that. But you don't have to go now. Not straight away. The Shah. I hate the Shah, shouted Riza passionately. I hate him. I had never seen my son behave like this before, and I was alarmed by his outburst. Eric stood staring out the window with both arms crossed beneath his cloak, and I sensed that for once he was truly discomforted by what he had precipitated. I signaled to a hovering servant and told him to take the child to his apartments at once, but as soon as the man laid hold on his shoulder, Riza flung himself down on the floor and began to pummel the blue tiles in a frenzy of rage. My son, that quiet, well-behaved child, had without any warning become a savage, mindless little beast, and I was bitterly aware that I was going to be powerless to control him without resorting to undignified physical force. Riza! The voice from the window was immeasurably soft, hardly more than a whispered breath, yet it made itself heard above all the ugly noise and the child's hysteria, and immediately there was silence in the sunny white walled chamber. Come to me. Into the gentle, mellifluous tone that had crept an irresistible note of command as I watched, Eric stretched out one hand and seemed to draw the child across the room to his side with a single gesture that pulsed with terrifying force. I became aware that I was holding my breath with a sort of dull horror. The same voice which was manipulating my child's mind was holding me in a frozen impotence that utterly denied all power of intervention. I felt as though I had been drugged by a massive dose of poppy syrup. Riza was perfectly calm now, though the tears still stood gleaming on his flushed cheeks. Will you come back? He whispered tremulously. Eric placed one skeletal finger beneath the boy's chin and tilted his face upward into the light. I will return as soon as my court duties permit. But if you cry when I leave, your father will forbid me to come here. You have behaved very badly in his presence. Go to him now and ask for his forgiveness. The child came to me like an automaton, with all the humility and deference that his master had commanded, and I forgave him graciously in the mindless response to that superior unspoken will. I felt the precise moment that Eric chose to release us from his hold. It was like the cutting off of some unseen electrical current. Even I had not already known him for his ruthless murder, but still, I should still have acknowledged him that day as the most dangerous man in the world. We left for Tehran the following morning, taking the old caravan road from the Caspian through the enticing glens and ravines of the Elburz Mountains. Huge vines had woven themselves like tapestry threads through the tangle of tree stems that clustered together in this thickly forest area. We made camp on a floor carpeted with wild strawberry plants, and at night, as we listened to the distant roar of a tiger, we saw the eyes of a leopard winking just beyond the firelight. There was snow on the top of this Demanda volcano, which is the highest peak in Persia, and though the mountain pass was not yet prey to the blizzards and treacherous avalanches that would be commonplace in winter, a cruel wind knifed through our warmest garments and made us bow our heads against the storm. My servants did their best under difficult circumstances, and we dined nightly on mutton, ragout, kebabs, and pilaf. But by now I was heartily weary of the road. When we finally approached Tehran, the sight of the city's ugly mud wall, circular towers, and 40-foot moat was one which gladdened my heart. If I had ended a pilgrimage to Mecca, I could have not felt more relief. My task was almost completed, and as soon I would be free of my strange, disquieting companion. As we passed beneath a gate adorned with glazed tiles, and were admitted to the city's interior, I heard Eric explain in disgust at the sight of the narrow, filthy streets and uncovered drains. "What squalor!" he muttered darkly. "What shameful poverty!" I felt inclined to agree with him, but I had no desire to appear critical of the Shah's personal extravagance and greed. "Certainly," I admitted warily. "The condition of the people is to be regretted." "The condition of the people is not at issue," he said coolly. "It is the city itself that appalls me. Have you no architects in Persia?" "There are worse places in the world," I muttered. "Not many, Daroga. Not many. This is the most disgraceful example of a capital city that I have ever seen. The whole area is a stinking bin bereft of a single building worthy of my attention, and that is exactly what I shall tell the Shah when I see him." "Allah," I breathed with feeling. "You'll be executed before dawn." "Yes, I dare say," he agreed. I looked at him with despair. "If you really intend to tell him that, you'd better learn to moderate your language." Reaching inside my coat, I brought out a folded sheet of paper and handed it to him. "These are some of the prescribed forms of address. I advise you to commit them to memory before your audience." He studied the paper for a moment and then burst out laughing. "Salutations, O glory of the world," he said in a wickedly mimicking tone. "Let me be your sacrifice, O shadow of God." Do you honestly expect me to mouth these nauseating garbage? I know it may sound a little absurd to European ears. It's worse than absurd, Daroga. It's an insult to human intelligence. "It's merely a court formality," I sighed. "It doesn't mean anything." "Then, if it doesn't mean anything, it won't matter if I don't say it," he retorted with infuriating logic. "I have no intention whatsoever of groveling like some ridiculous worm, simply to satisfy the colossal vanity of your king. I will speak to him with common civility and nothing more." "Oh, very well," I said irritably. "Insist on this mad infringement of etiquette if you must, but at least be sure you always call him sir." The laughter died out of his eyes without warning, and the look that replaced it turned me cold with fear. There is no man on this earth to whom I would ever accord that respect again, he snapped. I did not dare to question that abrupt statement, and we continued our journey toward the Ark on the northern side of town in gripped silence. As soon as we entered the palace complex, I lost him. For a moment, he was at my side as we walked through the maze of connecting rooms, and the next he was gone. It was as though he had simply vanished into the walls. This trick was not unfamiliar to me by now. Several times during our tedious trek through Russia he had performed a singular feat, abandoning me without warning or computation the moment his attention was caught by some unusual feature on the landscape. I had once lost him for more than a week on the Aktuba branch of the Volga, where much of the 65-mile area is covered with ancient ruins. But I could not believe that he would dare to disappear now, a bare half-hour before his appointed audience with the Shah. In mounting panic and fury, I trailed all over the sprawling building, muttering obscenities I seldom felt obligated to use, calling upon ever more colorful parts of God's anatomy for aid. I questioned every guard and servant that I passed, but no one seemed to have seen a man in a mask. If they had done so, they would have most certainly have remembered. Removing my kola, I wiped sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. Damn you, Eric! Damn you! When I get my hands on you, I'll wring your fertile neck for this. My frantic wanderings brought me eventually to the door of the council chamber. No, I thought. Surely not. He wouldn't dare. Pushing open the heavy door, I checked in aghast disbelief. Eric was sitting on the peacock throne, patiently prizing a diamond from the mass of gems which decorated the chair's lofty backrest. I stood and watched with horrified fascination as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a handful of cut glass, and selected a piece to replace the jewel he had removed. Allah have mercy, I gasped. He turned to look at me without alarm or surprise. Oh, there you are, he remarked calmly, as though he had been expecting me. Would you care for a diamond? A little keepsake to remind you of our happy journey together. I put out a hand to steady myself against the wall. Come down here, I said weakly. If you are discovered, it will be the end of both of us. In answer, he touched a mechanism at the rear of the throne and set the circular star of diamonds spinning wildly in a kaleidoscope of scintillating rays that blinded me for a second. There are rubies and emeralds, and of course, if you prefer, he continued imperturbably. But they would be harder to replace. It would be very much more convenient to me if you would simply settle for a diamond. Are you out of your mind? I almost screamed. For pity's sake, come down here and let us leave this room before it's too late. Oh, Daroga, he sighed. What a truly boring little fart you are at times. He came slowly down the 2 steps, which were decorated with salamanders, and paused to examine one of the 7 jeweled legs which supported the platform. This is a very great work of art, he remarked conversationally. I shall have come back later and have a better look at it. I was outraged by his brazen impudence. If you ever come back here again, I shall have you arrested, I snapped. He came to stand beside me thoughtfully. I don't think it would be very wise, my friend. You really might find 1 or 2 things rather difficult to explain. As he spoke, I became aware of something hard and cold nestling in my ear, and from that orifice I duly removed the diamond I had seen in his hand only moments earlier. The meaning was very clear. If I dared to speak of what I knew outside this room, he would simply plant the diamond upon my person again without a single scruple, and name me as his accomplice. When he saw that, I was speechless with fury. He went to the door and glanced out into the deserted corridor beyond. What remarkably lax security, he said pleasantly. I find Persian complacency quite beyond belief. Does that justify that? I demanded. Stealing from a thief is no theft," he replied mildly. From his sleeve I saw him draw my watch upon his familiar pocket chain and glance at it briefly. "We're late," he said severely, for all the world as though it were my fault, and tossing the watch at me with a careless gesture, he walked out of the room. I followed him with the uneasy demeanor of a faint-hearted criminal, not daring to contemplate how many more diamonds might be missing from the throne. If I had been a Catholic, I suppose I would have crossed myself. The Shah had agreed to receive us in the Gulidistan, the vast garden court which Europeans call the Rose Garden. Its winding paved avenues were lined with pines, cypress, and popular trees to create shade from the merciless sun, and all the flower beds, tanks, and lakes were separated from each other by neat gravel paths. Water ran perpendicularly down the innumerable little iron bridges lined with blue tiles, and Eric seemed as delighted as a child by the sight of the teeming fish, the elegant swans, and the noisy waterfowl. "Swans are ugly when they hatch," he said enviously, and yet, they grow to be the most beautiful and majestic of birds. That is one life's pretty little miracles, is it not? Like the snake, which sheds its skin, and the caterpillar, which turns into a butterfly. Metamorphosis." His voice grew soft and distant as he continued. "Yes, that is the true magic in this world, but its secret that has never been revealed, not even to the 10th graduate of the College of Sorcery. Would you like to be turned into a swan, Daroga?" I must have looked vaguely alarmed at the prospect, for he suddenly laughed. "Don't worry," he said rather sadly. "If such a physical alchemy really lay within my power, I certainly wouldn't waste it on you." "Come," I said, plucking at his sleeve and glancing over my shoulder uncomfortably. "We must not keep the Shah waiting any longer." Ahead of us, a beautiful kiosk could just be seen nestling among the trees, and it was here that we found the glory of the world, surrounded by a collection of his feline favorites. Toward me, the pampered creature displayed their customary response to intruders, a spectrum of behavior ranging from supreme indifference to overt hostility. But slowly, one by one, they left their embroidered cushions to rub their heads against Eric's legs. They behaved like dogs, greeting the return of a beloved master, fawning upon him and competing with each other for the jealousy of his caress. I was astonished by his unpreceded display, and so I could see was the Shah. Without waiting for the correct obscenities to be made, the young man got up from his chair and came forward with undisguised curiosity. "Remarkable," he muttered to himself. "I have never before observed such a phenomenon. Never, Daroga." A quick jerk of his wrist indicated my dismal. "You may leave us. Come, my friend," he continued, turning to address Eric pleasantly. "Walk with me in the gardens, and let me hear of these extraordinary gifts, for which it seems you may be quite justly famous." I lingered in the gardens for a couple of hours, and at length I saw Eric returning alone down the wide path which led to the lake. Once more he paused to admire the swans. As I drew near, he began to scatter little cakes of gauze on the water, and the birds dipped their long necks greedily to devour the mixture of manna, honey, and pistachios. The gauze was succeeded by a drill, the fondants in Turkish delight, and I was interested by the implication of this side play. If the Shah had honored him with sweetmeats at their first audience, then his favor was most certainly assured. "Who on earth is that funeral creature in the mask?" demanded a hearty voice in my ear. Turning hastily, I found the Grand Vizier standing beside me, and just beyond him his party of sycophants, usual obscurus toadies, who always managed to attach himself to a prominent man. Mirza Taqi Khan was married to the Shah's sister, and in consequence demanded automatic deference from anyone at court who not already was a sworn enemy. He was one of the most noble and incorruptible men in Persia. Too innately honest and opinionated, I often thought, to last for long in court, where groveling severity, subterfuge, and blatant bribery were the prerequisites for survival. He was loud in his condemnation of the age-old traditions of corruption, and his fierce determination to drag Persia into the modern world had already caused him to tread on many toes. Petty princelings such as myself had found our pensions reduced in accordance with the Grand Vizier's sweeping economies. He was in the course of funding a college where the best of European scientific knowledge might be put to good military use, and he did not seem to mind whom he offended in his ceaseless quest for the funding of his precious brainchild. Remaining in cheerful ignorance of the increasing number of ill-wishers, he continued to speak his mind in season and out, confident that royal status would always be his protection. I was not surprised that he had taken no trouble to lower his voice now as he looked with contempt at Eric. "This is the new magician, Excellency," I said quietly, hoping he would take a hint from the softness of my voice. I knew that Eric possessed the ears as well as the eyes of a cat, and was apt to hear what was inaudible to the average human. "Magician?" frowned the Prime Minister. "Ah, yes. I seem to remember some moonshine a while back about a miracle worker. Sent off to find him. Were you not, Nadir? Another absurd extravagance for the treasury to foot, I suppose. Never tell me he was worth the cost of that ridiculous journey." "He has some remarkable powers, Excellency," I said wearily. "Indeed? Well, I'm perfectly delighted to hear it. It's time the Khanum had a new toy to keep her occupied, and to take her mind away from the young fellow's affairs. No good ever comes of permitting a woman to interfere in politics, you know. I trust the odd bag of bones will be capable of amusing her long enough for me to get on with the serious business of the realm. I'm sure he's an utter charlatan, like all the rest, but for now he might have his uses. Extraordinary hands he has, they give me goose flesh. One rather hopes he knows how to keep them to himself. We really have quite enough of pittoresques at court, do we not, my friends?" Laughter came on cue from his attendants, and as the brightly colored party moved off again across the gardens in pursuit of the Shah, Eric came to join me in an ominous silence that displayed any last lingering hope I might have entertained of his ignorance. I knew as soon as I looked at him that he had heard every word. "Perhaps you would care to see the aviary," I said uncomfortably. I have heard sufficient squawking peacocks for one afternoon," he muttered. "What's that?" "Grand Vizier," I admitted unhappily. "Mirza Turki Khan." "Thank you. That is a name I shall take great pleasure in remembering. I assume he has influence. He is the Shah's brother by marriage, and his voice is respected by many." "But not by the Khanum," Eric suggested shrewdly. "Or, dare one say it, the young fellow?" "There have been on occasion certain differences of opinion." "How interesting. It may amuse me to follow this family friction more closely. From the council chamber, perhaps?" "Eric, it would be pleasant to bathe and change one's funeral garments," he interrupted coldly. "Perhaps you would be good enough to conduct me to my apartment now." I glanced at him uneasily as we made our way back to the palace. I suspected he would prove a hard and pitiless enemy, and I could not command the Grand Vizier's wisdom in winning him as such so early in the game. Eric's apartment was located among some of the finest at court, and I could see that he was mollified by the opulence that met his eye. He examined the white marble bathroom with satisfaction, and returned to arrange himself with languid grace across the Turkish divan. Painfully thin and angular though he was, he seemed incapable of any hurried or inelegant movement, and sometimes it was virtually impossible to chart his soundless progress around the room. Like a cat, he could be there one moment and gone the next, without exciting attention. I found a disturbing equality. "These apartments are normally reserved for an officer of state," I warned him. "You must expect to make enemies." "I never expect to make anything else," he said. "What did you discuss with the Shah?" I demanded curiously. "Among other things, the appalling architectural poverty of the city. Mouth dropped open. He wasn't angry? No, he was rather interested. He asked me to design and build a new palace outside Ashraf. If the result pleases him, I shall be permitted to rebuild Tehran. Allah! I breathed softly. Can you do that? There is nothing I cannot do if I choose. But Eric, you can't conjure up an entire palace. That requires professional training, experience of building. I have all. I've had all the experience I require, he said shortly. Are you sure? He leapt off the couch in the grip of some fierce and ugly emotion that I found impossible to comprehend. I learned my skills from a very great master mason. He spat unexpectedly. Do you dare doubt that? No. I backed away from him hesitantly, aware of cold sweat suddenly trickling down my temples. I don't doubt that you can do anything you say. Still, he advanced upon me, and I continued to retreat. I had never known such primitive, gut-laden fear, and my terror was touched with bewildered panic, for I could not think why my words should have made him so uncontrollably angry. Eric, I gasped. For pity's sake, I believe you. I believe you. Can't you hear me? He stopped abruptly. The hands that had been reaching out for my throat fell limply at his sides, and he looked at them with dull bewilderment. I suddenly had the feeling that he was very close to tears. I'm sorry, he said wearily, turning away from me. My temper is truly inexhaustible at times. I look for insults even when none are meant. It gets harder and harder to be rational, to pretend that I don't hear what they say. That ignorant fool in the garden. It's him I want to kill, not you. Not you. You have shown me nothing but civility. He made a gesture of frustration toward the mask and subsided into brooding silence. After a while, he drifted to the window and looked out with an absence that made me wonder if he realized I was still there. In his hand, he was suddenly holding what looked to me to be a silver compass, turning around and around with restless fingers. He taught me everything. I heard him murmur distantly. Everything. I can't go on wasting all that he gave me. I want to build something beautiful. Something you would have been proud of. There has to be a purpose in being in this world. There has to be some purpose in living. I waited patiently, expecting to hear more, but he did not speak again. His hand was empty now. The compass was gone as suddenly and mysteriously as it appeared. He seemed sunk in a very deep reverie as he stared down into the ghostin below. And at last, believing it would be both intrusive and discourteous to linger, I slipped quietly from the room and left him alone.